Welcome everybody, and as you, my regular listeners know, my viewers, hello. I'm always delighted to have my guests on, and today is no different. I have the wonderful and brilliant Mary Shea PhD, no less. Forgive me, Mary, I forgot to put that on your thing here behind me. And I've been following Mary for a while. Mary's now the Global Innovation Evangelist at Outreach. We'll get into Outreach in a minute. And then before that, at Forrester, in terms of an analyst there, producing some amazing content, kind of where the world of sales and marketing is going. And your PhD, Mary, is in musicology and the I'm going to get it wrong.
Ethnomusicology,
which is a first for me as well. And of course, our paths crossed with our mutual friend Kate at Lately AI in terms of what Lately does with the neuroscience of music. So we may or may not get into that. So I'm going to kick things off before we get into the who, what, why, when, where. But what caught my attention, Mary, and those of you, if you go and find Mary's profile on LinkedIn, which I'll put at the end of this show, her banner image at the top is Revenue Innovators, noun, a new cohort of revenue leaders who put buyers at the center of their strategies, who arm their sellers with the most innovative sales technologies, and who over-index on data rather than intuition to inform their business decisions. Because I think there's a lot to unpack there. But before we get into that, who Mary, who, what, why, when, where? Thank you.
Wow, well, that was quite an introduction. Thank you so much for having me on the show today, Alexander. I'm happy to be here. And Kate is a good friend of mine. I actually got a chance to know her probably maybe a little bit over a year ago. And I'm just fascinated with the company and the technology and her personality as a wonderful leader and technologist. So it's great to have those mutual connections. I wish I could tell you I was a doctor of revenue, but I'm not. And I wish I could say there was a strong connection between my PhD and what I do today. And there's a little bit of a connection as you sort of pulled out that thread. Mm-hmm. A lot of people who are in the business world actually have started with PhDs in the humanities, and particularly in technology, because there's a strong connection between that right brain and left brain connection, where music is both very much an art and a science, and technology is as well. So that's a little bit about my academic background. I was a professional musician, a classical oboist for the first few years of my career, traveled all over the world and played in a number of different orchestras, and then got my PhD in musicology and ethnomusicology. And musicology is the study of Western art music. So what we would typically think of as classical music. Mm-hmm. And then ethnomusicology is really interesting. It's has its roots in anthropology. So it's really looking at the social science aspects of music. And so in ethnomusicology, we look at musics that are passed down primarily in oral tradition, not written down, and passed from one generation to the next. So I learned a lot about how to play the Chinese oboe, the Balinese gamelan, some different types of drums from Ghana, and here I am today as an evangelist at Outreach. So
yeah, I was going to say
we have to sit down for dinner to have a much longer conversation about how all of that transpired. But that's the short story.
that's fascinating, and some instruments I've never heard of as well. So I'll need to Google those after this. So for as I mentioned before, we kind of came online when we're chatting in the green room as I talk about our imaginary green room. My background is it's sales through and through, but it's primarily professional services, so lawyers, accountants, and commercial real estate. So for those that are listening that haven't heard of Outreach, would you mind just kind of giving a high-level elevator pitch on what Outreach is all about?
Sure. Thanks so much. So Outreach is a sales technology platform, and we're one of the leading providers and platforms within the overall sales technology marketplace right now. Mm-hmm. And what Outreach does is it helps sellers of all shapes and sizes, and also revenue leaders and sales managers, manage the day-to-day activities of the go-to-market organization. Mm-hmm. So we help sellers in particular manage their omni-channel cadences and interactions, and orchestrate those interactions with their customers and prospects. And you mentioned you have a large following in ProServe. Well, all of the folks that actually interact with customers and prospects need to do it in a variety of different channels, whether that's social, whether that's LinkedIn InMail, whether it's email, whether it's traditional calling or remote meetings like this. And so our system, which has embedded AI and automation, helps anyone manage those interactions, automatically extracts all of the human behavioral activity between buyers and sellers and uploads it to the CRM. So it takes the sellers out of the data entry game, which nobody really liked, and actually nobody really did. And then it uses, we have embedded AI that will help organizations derive insights from large data sets. And so that's at the highest level. We do a lot of other things. We're a multi-product platform. So we have digital coaching capabilities. We have the ability for buying teams and selling teams to come together and create mutual action plans. And we've got some other news, which I'm not at liberty to disclose, but very, very soon we'll be announcing some additional capabilities for the revenue leaders, both marketing and sales ops, revenue ops.
Exciting. It seems like something's happening every week with outreach in terms of what you and the broader team and Scott and so on are talking about, which is why love following what you're doing. So thank you for that high level overview. And that kind of sits within kind of what I think sales engagement platforms. Is that kind of a fair? Are you in that space, or is that not fair?
It's interesting because the technology landscape right now is really in a dynamic place where we're seeing significant consolidation and also category creep from one category to another. So I'll give you a cheeky answer. We started out as sales engagement, which really has, when you think about that nomenclature, that terminology, it really makes people think of front of the cycle reps and high velocity sales. And we do so much more. We're enabling sellers across the entire buying cycle. But as you start to think about the extraction of all this data, we're really going into intelligence as well. So if you think about activity and consumption of content, all of that can be extracted and used to derive massive amounts of intelligence and insights. So I'm starting to call the category engagement and intelligence, and we'll see if I can get the analyst in the market to follow me.
Engagement and intelligence. You heard it here first on the Death of a Salesman podcast. So if we kind of break down, going back to the revenue innovators, if I look at where I guess for me, 2015 is where I started to see this concept of sort of sales enablement, if you will. Then it kind of seemed to morph into sales effectiveness. Then we kind of morphed into sales ops. Then it became revenue operations. Now it seems to be moving into revenue intelligence, as you talked about it there. Is it all fundamentally the same thing? I guess it's, from my perspective, it's the glue which kind of brings sales and marketing together. Or are we actually, to your point, creating a new category? Are we creating another layer on top of a layer on top of a layer, which sometimes is what it feels like? And are we overcomplicating things in what we're trying to do here?
Wow, there was a lot in that statement question. And I'm going to pull up for a few moments. I think you almost have to start before 2015 when you think about the sales technology landscape. And prior to 2015, the only show in town was CRM, customer relationship management, right? And then CRM, Salesforce went public in 2004. I think they went out at 11. They're trading well over $200 and have a I think it's a $200 billion valuation, if I'm correct. So prior to 2015, like I said, organizations would buy CRM, they check that box and we're like, yeah, we have all the sales technology we need. But the challenge was that CRM was never actually designed for sellers, how they go about their day-to-day activities, what their workflows and their processes look like. And as you know, probably as much as anyone else, nobody used it. No. And it's been the bane of sellers' existence for so long, right? I'm always like, why are people shocked that sellers don't use CRM? Well, it has nothing to do with how they go about their work. And it has everything to do with activity tracking, pipeline management, stuff that managers and executives care about. But interestingly enough, in 2015, you started to have these new technologies that were geared exclusively for the seller to help them be more effective and efficient. And some of those initial players were Yesware and ToutApp and others, and they got some of the really big early investments. And I think 2015 was the time that you could really say the sales technology landscape or marketplace started to be built. Very similar to what happened with marketing automation back in 2009. Yeah. We had a ton of really innovative point solutions that ultimately consolidated until some of the bigger players that we know today, whether it's Engagio or all of the big players that we know. So it's really interesting. I think where we are now is that you have maturation with some of those smaller point solutions. And now we're in a world where businesses are scaling back. They're having smaller, more nimble sales teams, and their boards and senior executives understand that automation and AI can bring tremendous lift to the sales organization. And so now you're starting to see some of these point solutions consolidate into platforms, which I actually believe companies like Outreach and others, whether it's Zoom Info or Sixth Sense or even Gong, these are the platforms of the future that are going to be that single pane of glass that everyone on the revenue team uses. And I don't want to hurt Benioff's feelings or anyone, who just spent $7 million on CRM, because I have those conversations all day. CRM's still worthwhile and useful. It's just going to play a different role as we get deeper into the 21st century, more like, when ERP shifted from the front office to the back office. And so I think CRM will be some sort of a customer database, CDP, what have you, while these other platforms that are really designed for how revenue teams work will come to the forefront. And it's an amazing, exciting time, and don't expect it to get simpler to understand anytime soon.
I agree with you, and I think that I feel the same. And I always get frustrated when people go, "This CRM system is crap and not very good." It's like, well, hang on a second. Fundamentally, it's a dumb, innate piece of software. It's the outputs that you're trying to achieve and the inputs to get to those outputs, and it's a management tool. It's always been seen as a management tool. I need to do this because they just want stats. However, I feel that what I'm seeing is that CRM is having a renaissance, but because it's the silo, the brain, if you will, of the organization. But absolutely, then it needs to be on top of that. You mentioned kind of the CDPs, and it's fascinating looking at kind of where Microsoft is going in the CDP world and going, look, we fundamentally don't care where your data is. If it's in Salesforce, if it's in this, that, it's Facebook ads, we'll bring it all into one place. So irrespective of what role you have within the organization, you can access that data, and then going on your strapline or tagline on your LinkedIn profile, you then over-index on that data and start to make better, more informed decisions. And I warned you I'd go and refer to Seth and what Seth talks about from Forrester. Seth Mars, if you're not following him, please do. What Seth and the team are now talking about is that from a sales perspective, that dynamic guided selling, which actually reflects on a blog post that I read in 2017 by author's name, forgive me, I can't remember, but she talks about do you need to hire basically data scientists in your marketing team? And it was a former LinkedIn exec who's now at Cisco, and she basically, I think she tweeted something along the lines of, I paraphrase, any marketing, but bear in mind this is 2017, any marketing exec that goes into a data-led board meeting and starts the sentence with I think, will probably be asked to leave. That's back in 2017, right? And only now in 2021, with a global pandemic, which fingers crossed we're starting to come through the other side of this to accelerate all of this and prove across all industries that some of the perceptions of what could be done can be done in a different, more effective way. Seth was saying there's still 5 years to go before he believed that we'll start to see the real gains in all of this. And I'm going to say something not controversial, but the automation AI aspect, I feel, is potentially going to create a possible challenge for sales organizations, because sales people, again, careful what I say here, are we relying on this too much just to automate without thinking about what we're actually doing? And I was on a brilliant podcast with Marcus Kalki last week. He's talking about buyer safety. LinkedIn's now talking about being buyer first, buyer centric, all this. But like 20 years ago, Mary, when I was in the world of recruitment, all I could do was bash the phones because that's all we had. I was told you got to put the buyer first. So why are we still talking about that today? And I'll shut up in a minute because this is about you and not me. And then you quoted in your interview with LinkedIn, which you posted last week, around this discrepancy between sellers believe they are taking a buyer first approach, but the buyers have a very different perspective on this.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so again, so many different things to cover here, but we've been talking about the buyer first for a long time, but honestly, Alexander, we've also been talking about marketing and sales alignment for 100 years too, and that's never happened, right? So I guess maybe it's the journey, not the destination. We'll have to see. When I posted on the LinkedIn article or interview that I did, and the data point is that 65% of sellers believe they're approaching their selling motions with buyer centricity, but only 25% of buyers actually agree. Yeah. That's a massive discrepancy, as you said. And someone said to me on LinkedIn, what's going on? Are sellers delusional? And I don't think they're delusional. I think, they are doing things the way they've always done things, right? With sales, it's about getting a process, being efficient, refining that process, iterating on that process. And I'm trying to optimize the amount of time you have in each day, because as a seller, there's never enough time in the day. So I think it actually starts with crafting buyer-centric strategies. I don't think it's all the sales people's fault. It really starts with, how are you thinking at the highest levels in your organization about going to market? And are you putting the buyer at the center of everything you do, from your strategy to your execution? One example would be, we all have sales stage milestones in our CRM, right? So we can allocate resources, so we can forecast, so we have some predictability to the business. Well, why don't you call them buying stages, and why don't you rebrand those to indicate how the buyer would want to engage with you at that stage if they were really interested in your product or service? And then you have compensation plans that are actually driving activities that will push the seller away from the buyer rather than bringing them in. So the buyer has evolved. And as Seth and his cohort over at Forrester and Forrester Decisions Group, they're saying now we can't even say the buyer, we have to say buying groups, because there's really, typically the average B2B sale has 11 people involved on the short end, and up to 22 people involved for a more complex sale. So I guess I should say, I submit we stop saying the buyer and say, buying collectives, buying groups. And so there's a lot of different things that go into it, versus the salespeople just aren't focused in going to market with a buyer-centric mentality. Compensation plans drive sellers to align with your sales strategy and your corporate strategy. And I've seen so many, really shitty comp plans. Sorry, I hope it's okay. That are, focused on quantitative metrics, because those metrics allow your most senior executives to gain comfort by doing mathematical computations to understand if they're going to hit their numbers or not to deliver a great buyer experience. So I think I've gone on a tangent. I'll get off my soapbox.
you haven't. And interestingly, the podcast with Marcus last week, he's very much of the same view. And all the research out there that actually shows that money, just in life generally, is one of the worst levers to actually get someone to do something, because it just starts to generate and create the wrong behaviors. And it takes me back to when I was doing a course with the Association of Professional Sales, which is a UK-based organization, recently merged with the Institute of Sales Management, I believe. And there's a chap from Oracle there, so, senior leader from Oracle, going, we tried to get our Oracle reps to sell the smaller deals, but were more profitable. But because it was the massive numbers that got the headlines and got the notice of the leadership team, even if those weren't necessarily profitable or it didn't make any money at all, the reps still lent towards that, even though they could have earned more comp going down that other that other piece. And I've been there and done it in my recruitment days. I remember smashing my target, and I was leader for like 10 weeks within my business, and then I wasn't, and then all of a sudden I was the forgotten child again. It's like, oh, that was fun while it lasted. And you touched on we've kind of always done it this way. And it's interesting because, again, in my world, in professional services, we see a lot of that. The way that partners are remunerated is always a big bone of contention in kind of the LLP structure, because of what that drives. And it reminds me of a podcast I did with Justin Michael, who I think you know.
Oh yeah, we're really friendly. I love Justin. Super Perfect. Brilliant guy.
Excellent. So Justin, likewise, his book's out, Tech Powered Sales and all this kind of things. Did a podcast with him and a guy called Patrick Joyce, and they were talking about, rather Patrick was actually saying, if he's starting from scratch in kind of SaaS world, he would create a cohort of a team. So there's your RevOps person or Rev Intelligence. That's your SDR. That's possibly your AE. There's your marketing person and maybe a data person. That's your number. That's what I need you to report back to me in 12 months' time. Go figure it out. Go do what you need to do and make that work. We will make sure you've got the best-in-class technology to support you on that. You touched on Zoom Info and kind of the third-party data to help you make better, more informed decisions about who to target, when to target, how to have those conversations, and get away from, again, you touched on it in your interview, the kind of the MQLs, the marketing qualified leads are not fit for purpose and this and that, because sales and marketing aren't talking to each other. And then you also touch on the fact that there is this challenge that even when you get a sales leader and a marketing leader in the same room, they're both KPI differently. They're both driven by different outcomes. So this is, for me, and this is why I was really keen to get you on and kind of hear your side of the coin from a tech play, because from the consulting world that I come from, this is as much the human transformation, people change play, enabled and supported by technology.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's so interesting, the sales and marketing piece. One of the things that I think is happening is you're seeing buyers are doing more and more on their own. So there's a lot going on with self-discovery. There's a lot of information out there. There's digital content to download. There's podcasts like these. There's all kinds of other things. And the sellers are getting less and less direct time, sort of influencing those discussions. Simultaneously, the technology is maturing such that if used correctly and with the right methods and motivation, you can go to market in such a smart way. You understand your buyer before you've had that first interaction, what they care about, what they worry about, what business affiliations they're part of, what the last podcast was that they've been on. And you can really tailor that interaction. And I found that when sellers do that, they get a really, really positive outcome. When they don't get a positive outcome. The other thing I'm seeing is that organizations that are willing to experiment and look at innovative ways of teaming up. A lot of companies are actually looking at pods now, which is exactly like what you said. So you've got a marketing person, an SDR type of person. You've got maybe your full cycle rep, and then a post-sale person. And they're working together as a team, and they can be very, very responsive to client and prospect needs. And they're dialed in together, and they're all gold with the same goals. And that's one of the things that I think can help deliver a much more buyer-centric experience.
And I guess then that's a CRM system cannot do that. Salesforce, Microsoft cannot provide that environment, but you then layer it with an outreach on top of that, with the the data insights and so on and so on. I don't doubt that Salesforce and Microsoft will, or maybe one of them will buy you. Who knows?
We might be too expensive.
in terms of that, and that then, for me, also, dare I say this, comes to a skills gap, possibly, in terms of actually enabling, having the right people to understand what to do with this, and it's not just a let's feed it into the machine. And it reminds me of a UK cartoon when I was a kid called Big Bertha, where you put something in one end and a different kind of toy came out the other end. You do need to work with the technology, and that's kind of on that point where you touched on the over-index on data rather than intuition to inform their business decisions. And again, I think the world that we operate in, if I look back to the experience I've gained, I'm 42, 43 now, versus when I was straight out of university into smashing the phones and recruitment days 20 years ago. I do feel that there is an element of that gut instinct which still has a place, but can be supported by either validating that gut instinct, or you go, okay, I know I've got all the data here. I think a doctor is a good example of this. I know I've got all the data here, but there's just something in me that tells me my 20, 30 years of being a doctor in whatever the medicine is, I feel it's this. So for me, I don't believe that we should become too reliant on technology. And you touched on this in your interview, because we will then lose that buyer first approach, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, it's like anything in life, it's balance, right? And moderation. And so when, I'm a little bit older than you, but when you and I were selling, and we were out there pounding the phones and doing what we did, we definitely were more focused on the art and sort of the quantitative metrics, right? So it was volume. If you reach the right volume of activities, you're going to get the right outputs on your pipeline. Today, we're in a different place. And now, we do have the tools and we do have the data, which can create efficient, predictable growth. And organizations at the leadership level, as well as the rep level, do need to lean more into the science of the profession, in my view. But the art never goes away. I mean, people value human connections. People want to look that seller in the eye when they make a big B2B purchase. You're putting in some cases, your professional reputation on the line when you bring in a new vendor or new technology or a new solution. And so the AI is really designed to give you options, right? Here's a couple of different recommendations. You could do X, Y, and Z based on the insights that we've gathered from the algorithms we created and the data we churned out. And you as a seller need to apply your experience, your expertise, your intuition, what have you, to choose the right next step. So I don't ever see a world where, certainly with very, very high velocity sales, you could see a world where it's completely automated. But, in the types of sales that we're talking about, ProServe or, large technology outsourcing or whatever it is, bigger enterprise deals, I don't ever see a world where the technology replaces a salesperson. It just amplifies what they're able to do. It creates better efficiencies, gives them greater scale, and gives them insights from which they can decide on how to proceed. And that's, that's the brilliance of the role. And I don't think that should go away.
I'm very glad that you said that, because I fully admit, in my earlier days when I started out doing my my thing, I was out there going, is the world of the SDR kind of dead? Is cold calling dead? Cold calling very much isn't dead. It all depends on your markets. There isn't kind of one size fits all. Yes, it's interesting in terms of the research that is now coming out in a post-pandemic world. I think with McKinsey, December 2020, this was when they published this, 3,500 buyers of B2B services, and 15% of those respondents said they'd happily spend over $1 million on a product or service in a virtual environment. Now, that's not saying I don't necessarily want to meet someone, but I don't necessarily have to physically meet that someone.
Yeah. Exactly.
I can do it in this environment, and it's interesting. I'm going to kind of go a little bit kind of left field, but certainly the ProServe's FS space, purpose ESG is now coming into how organizations act and behave. And, some of the larger law firms recognize they can't put a partner on a plane first class to fly halfway around the world for a 1 hour meeting, which they then charge the client for. Carbon footprint, all this kind of stuff. It doesn't really kind of send out that that message. And your play on the science versus the art reminds me of the brilliant Fallon Fatami, who set up Node, and then she recently sold to Sugar. Where again, if you put Fallon Fatami into YouTube's little quotable insights, she said the science is only as good as the art of sales. However, absolutely to your point, and I will stand down on my kind of views on that, is that if I look at the art of sales that I learned then versus what I'm learned now, they are it's very, very different, because to your point around the omni-channel approach, people can access much more information and so on. So I believe we're in for, I believe, a really exciting time. It's just this kind of tension I fear at the moment with the narrative we are seeing out there, in terms of buyers don't want to talk to salespeople crap, all this, and it becomes almost, for me, I feel, a self-fulfilling prophecy that if we keep kind of saying this rather than kind of what you're saying, just take a step back from all of this. And if we're going to be truly buyer-centric, let's focus on the buyers. And
I mean, if you think about some of the best salespeople you've interacted with, they add so much value. I mean, they're consultative, they're advisors, they help you figure out how to fund, a large solution. They're people that you take from one company to the next when you move. Sometimes there's more loyalty to the actual brand of the seller than the service or product you're buying. So I think there is a lot of hype out there. And I think there's also a lot of hype about this in person or, digital virtual. And it's funny, like, I'm actually calling this what you and I are doing. This is in person. I'm in person. Yeah. We're in person. Agreed. So I'm actually starting to say on-site versus remote or virtual, because I think it's a better way of describing it. And I don't think that these on-site meetings will go away. What we are seeing is that, as your digital natives are now economic decision makers, not just influencers or pulling together the initial list or what have you, these folks and even the Gen Zs that are coming up behind them are extremely comfortable leveraging technology to have good, efficient and authentic connections. And so maybe the first 5 to 6 meetings get done in a more efficient way. And then you do go and actually meet in person. So again, I don't think it's an all or nothing, Alexander. I think we have to, help the market understand we don't need to over-index like entirely in one direction. The other thing I think that's really kind of interesting about the on-site versus the virtual digital is that when the pandemic first hit, I think it was Corporate Visions did a study that said 60 to 70% of B2B salespeople did not believe they could be successful if they couldn't work the room.
Yeah.
Then I think by January and February, we realized, okay, people actually can sell, and, you get your circle light and set things up, and you can do synchronous and asynchronous videos to help you. Now, I think it's all about hybrid and hyper hybrid. So you may go to a meeting, Alexander, and you may actually have 1 or 2 people in the room, but then you've got 20 up on the monitor who are zooming in, because now buying groups are highly distributed. So again, I don't think it's an all or nothing situation.
Likewise, and agreed. My wife works in one of the big four consulting firms, and she actually said they had one of their kind of first proper hybrid client meetings where she was in the office in town in London, and she said she was quite surprised because the technology worked. It all works really, really well, and it was all, it's like everyone had a very, very tight agenda. Everyone had to know kind of what's what. So I'm with you. I also get frustrated in terms of putting any kind of word in front of selling. It's just sales and marketing for the 21st century. We're just having to just do it in a different way, but we're all still trying to achieve the same end goal, fundamentally, as to what I was doing 20 years ago, you were doing 20 years ago in the world of sales, which is, create a solution for your client that works. It's just a different way, more efficient way of doing this. Now I want to kind of move again. We touched on this before we kind of came on air. I don't know why I say that, because this isn't live, but it makes me feel better about myself. The world of kind of professional services. So I'm going to include FS in this as well. So financial services, pro service. So big banks, traditional institutions. We could probably lump insurance in there as well. I truly believe that what outreach is doing, you mentioned Gong in terms of kind of the voice, the world of voice as well, absolutely have a play in that industry. I think it's going to be a very brave organization to make that leap, just as they're trying to get their head around this thing's called CRM is actually quite important, getting people to use it. Then you look at PwC's story with Salesforce and the global rollout, the rollout they've done there with IntraHive. Based on what you're seeing, what you're hearing in the role of your global innovation within outreach, what are you hearing or seeing kind of on the ground, as it were, within the professional services space?
Yeah, it's a great point. And, it's no surprise that outreach and many of the other technology players that we've discussed in this conversation have started out selling into the technology space, into SaaS, SMBs. And we are at Outreach really taking a concerted effort to work with enterprise customers now. And we are adapting the platform to have the right types of functionality that's going to serve that level of customer. Some of it includes compliance or, other types of more customized workflows and so on and so forth. But those organizations are absolutely going to need these types of platforms as well. And when I was at Forrester, I worked with a number of FinServ customers, namely, I would say the ones with the big advisor networks or financial advisor networks, where they really needed to be digitally activated to engage effectively with their end customers. But I think the one thing that the global pandemic has really showed us, well, it's showed us a lot of things, but one of the things is that the companies that were digitally prepared were able to adapt and pivot very quickly with very few hiccups. The more traditional businesses that were laggards, who strategically decided, we don't need to make all these investments in the technologies, were really struggling, and it took them longer to kind of bounce back. And as we look at the next normal, and I'm really intentional about saying that because I don't believe we're going back. And you mentioned, PwC and McKinsey and a number of these other companies that are also doing great thought leadership. We're all saying the same thing, that even if you have a traditional business, you're probably going to have a fairly distributed workforce. We're embarking on a talent shortage, not just at restaurant and frontline workers, but also within the selling and business professions. And one of the first questions that people ask in the interview is, do I have a flexibility to work from home? So we're in a world where there's going to be highly distributed interactions between sellers and buyers, and organizations need to ensure they have the right technology systems for their employees to engage effectively in that environment.
Awesome. So I'm glad to I'm like, literally every pro serve firm that I talk to, especially if they're kind of in kind of CRM review, I'm like, are you considering an outreach or sales loft and so on? And none of them have heard of you. None of them have heard of this kind of environment in this world that they are that they're in. Conscious of time, Mary, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? Where's the best people for people to reach out and find you and start a conversation?
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity, Alexander. So I'm really accessible, believe it or not, even though I'm super, super busy. So I'm very engaged in LinkedIn, and I will respond and send reports and give you advice, or, just have a nice social connection. Also very involved. I'm active on Twitter. I have my Revenue Innovators podcast with Harish Mohan, my colleague. So we drop a new podcast every couple of weeks. If there's any innovators out there in the revenue field in ProServe or in your world, I'd love to hear from them, what they're doing to kind of break glass in their organization. We'd love to feature them on the podcast. And I'm out there at all of the big industry events. I'm doing a keynote at the B2B Sales and Marketing Exchange in Boston. That's actually my first analog event in, awesome. I want to say almost 20 months. So
nuts.
Yeah, it's nuts. So I'm super, super excited and love to talk to any of your listeners.
Awesome, fantastic, and an amazing human being. She's just popped into my head from PwC, who was part of the Salesforce rollout. So I'll message her privately and see if I can connect you.
Oh, I would love that. I would love that.
An interesting conversation. Mary, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alexander. Hope to meet you soon in London.
Absolutely.